Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. What lies beneath the surface? What lies below? Well, we talk about the underground a lot here at the Bureau. Not London's subterranean rail system, amazing though that is, but the countercultural underground of the 50s, 60s, 70s and even the 80s. And the underground, or should I say the underworld, is the subject of this episode. For before me lies an astonishing book. A book that reminds that beneath our world of surfaces of gloss and illusion, superficiality and first impressions, sensory saturation and instant gratification, there's a literal and imaginary labyrinthine world of the subterranean that throughout human history has been a source of awe, inspiration and mysteries. And it's a book that illustrates, I think, this astonishing back and forth between the real and the imagined, how the actual physical world beneath us has fed our fears and visions, and conversely, how it has provoked us to imagine a mythic, mysterious otherworld, the afterworld of the dead, or of the fairies, or of the psychological unconscious. Phew. Well, I'm very pleased that the author and compiler of that book, Underworlds, A Compelling Journey Through the Subterranean Realms, Real and Imagine, is here with me to take us on a journey beneath. Stephen Ellcock is a London-based online collector and researcher curator, former musician and bookseller. We might get into that. He's been called or described as the image alchemist, and he spent the last decade collecting an ever-growing virtual museum, a digital cabinet of curiosities, of images from the atomic to the celestial, the microscopic to the monumental. The author of All Good Things, The Book of Change, The Cosmic Dance, co-author with Matt Osman of England on Fire, a brilliant book as well. And here he is. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Listen, as I said to you before, this is, I think, a marvellous work. You know, for artists, musicians, writers, you know, anybody's in the creative field, but also for dreamers, for people who are interested in, you know, the other, the mysterious. And I think, you know, fundamentally for me, and it's like a bit of a kind of countercultural handbook of imagery. And I want to say something straight away, because you've been complimented a million times on your amazing ability to find and source and put together these images. But actually, I want to give you another compliment, which is that I think the text in this book is terrific.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I labour long and hard over the text, and so that means a great deal. It tends to be overshadowed by the images, and to me, the two things are almost equal importance. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, before we head downwards, I thought we'd talk a little bit about you. Okay. And just give us a quick tour through the upper world of Stephen Ellcock.
Well, I was born in Essex some time ago, and I've had quite a kind of picaresque and checkered history. I've done many things in my life, working in publishing and in bookselling, but I was also a musician for quite a number of years, and latterly somehow managed to sustain a kind of career based around being an online curator, which just happened purely by default, because I had absolutely no intention of joining or having anything to do with social media at the time that I was strong-armed into signing up to Facebook, which is, I think, 2009.
Facebook was a different kind of thing, right?
Different.
Well?
It was a different proposition then, yes.
But there's a very famous opening to a very famous work, which starts off with somebody who wakes up in the middle of a forest, sort of, as it were, in midlife.
Yes,
Dante Alighieri.
yes.
It's obviously very important in terms of this book, but actually, when I read about or heard about your beginnings, something of that, without wishing to put you on the spot, but sounded a bit dramatic, because this sort of life as yours came out of a dark wood in some way, didn't it?
The analogy to Dante, it's very pat and rather trite to sort of say, well, in the middle of my journey through life, I suddenly found myself in a moment of crisis in a dark wood, and then managed to extricate myself through it after all kinds of travelling through various realms. But there is some truth in that. And when I first joined Facebook, I was in a bad place. I was living in Peckham, which isn't a bad place. I love Peckham. The psychic history of Peckham is extraordinary. There's all kinds of things. I was very, very ill. At one point I was given 3 months to live by a rather sort of Bruce doctor. And I was quite isolated, bedridden for a while. And One of my sisters persuaded me, so you're stuck at home, why don't you have a look at Facebook? To me, that was sort of anathema. I didn't have a computer or PC or laptop or anything at that point. I had a rather sort of primitive mobile phone. And then after a while, I caved in. I started enjoying it, started connecting to people and that I hadn't been in touch with for quite a number of years. But also, it was almost unmediated at that point. So you could actually do things like send Iggy Pop or Patti Smith or Grace Jones friend requests, and they would accept that. They were there. They soon retreated when they realised, oh my God, there's no way that they could deal with what they were bombarded with. But it was just the most extraordinary thing. There was one occasion where I found myself 3 o'clock in the morning having a conversation with somebody about badgers, and I realised I was actually talking to Brian May.
Brian May from Queen?
Yeah.
Badgers is one of his interests.
I was fairly bored with that kind of aspect of it, and just to sort of as a way of amusing myself really and a few close friends, I started posting images, getting this extraordinary response, which sort of snowballed and gathered a pace really quickly. And I realised that there was no real world equivalent of this. There was an opportunity to create something, this limitless museum, like a sort of infinite archive of things. I was getting response from all over the world. It became an obsession. Although my background in terms of sort of academic things, I have no training in art, or by no means an actual artist myself.
I want to jump in here because that's slightly modest, because actually when you were a kid, you were obsessive collector of images in paper form, right? You used to cut up magazine images to make collages, right? So it's not like this wonderful story though it is, it's not like it appeared absolutely from nowhere. You had a sort of history of that in the pre-internet age, right?
I hesitate to use the word vocation, but this is what I should have been doing all along. Guess what it is? It was a pattern-making impulse that manifested itself in various ways throughout my life. Even in things like working in bookshops, I was obsessed with merchandising and things like that, in the way that books are displayed and juxtaposition of titles and things. And also when I was in the music business, my technical skills as a musician were really negligible, but I found that I was very good at arranging and producing the way that things fitted together, even though I had no particularly technical knowledge. It's a way that my brain seems to work.
I just want to put this in context because roll on to where now, and I mean, I think, Stephen, you're our first bona fide influencer, I think I described as a social media
I'm not sure
influencer.
I was, but maybe...
It's a sort of awful phrase, I know that, right? But you become a kind of social media figure because what you've been doing, creating this infinite archive, actually, has got so many followers. So your background in collecting images and your background in, you say, this pattern making, actually gave this curatorial thing to the images that you were selected, had some significance and some beauty, and also the way that you put them next to each other was provoking people to respond. It wasn't just, hey, there's a picture of a dog with a bow tie on it, and you know, like everybody else is doing.
It's very calculated, and I spend an inordinate amount of time deliberating and working out particularly the sequencing of images. That, to me, that's the key. That now everybody's on Facebook and Instagram and things, but anybody can get an X thousand number of likes by posting a certain type of art. To me, the important thing is the juxtaposition of images. To me, there is an ongoing, unfolding narrative, and it does have a kind of conclusion at some point in the distant future. It is always crucial in what I do. I'm commentating on the world. I'm referencing current events. It may not be, it's not apparent, and it's not obvious, and it's not explicit.
So you're responding to the culture.
I'm responding to culture, yeah.
And then the images that you choose in somewhere to do that response.
Yes.
Right? Now, so I think there's something quite significant going on here, and actually, I'll be frank about it, also it's quite a relief because with all the marvels of the modern world and social media, and you know there are some amazingly good things about it, what seems to me to becoming increasingly important is that we've got people who are curating, right?
Yes.
Because my own experience is that, you know, when I'm surfing and doing stuff, is that I come across wonderful images. I might find some alchemical images, and it's like, well, what am I going to do with them?
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can save them to a folder and become a kind of data holder, but then do I look at them again? No. So what actually happened with you, which I think is that you're building up this online bank archive, let's call it that, of themed images, which are sort of actually significant in themselves, but also in their juxtaposition with each other. Yes. And then what happened is that then you started to be asked, as it were, to go back in time to produce these things,
Yes,
books,
yes.
right? Then we have the whole cycle where the internet and media allows collecting and the display that way. And then it comes down to, for me, which is still really important, it's a physical artifact, a book,
Yes.
where it's been carefully selected and curated and put into a context with text. In the infinite images, the infinite sounds, the infinite music and ideas and texts that are out there, how do we navigate them unless we set out off into the landscape with somebody who's guiding us?
I'm not saying I'm a Virgil of the internet, but that's what I hope. And I do think that what I do has some comparisons with artists and filmmakers in particular. The creators, whether they be in art or fashion or music, the people that respond to what I do. It's a really interesting cross-section. And some really fantastic things have happened in the past year or so, and more things in the pipeline, whereby, particularly with people involved in dance and fashion, which is really fascinating to me. For example, there was a ballet based on England on Fire at Sadler's Wells last autumn, which to me was extraordinary when they approached Matt Osman and myself. We love this book and we'd like to turn it into a ballet. That was the most extraordinary thing to see the book taking on a different life.
And that's what I meant in some ways, that this thing going in a cycle, because it's
Yes.
like, where otherwise will all this virtual, digital, in the ether stuff go if it doesn't go back into the
Yes.
culture in a quite
Yes.
direct forms, right?
Yeah.
But I think that we are entering an age where a great thing has happened, which is that technology has democratized creativity, right?
Yes.
So basically anybody can make
Yes,
pretty good
yeah,
music now,
yeah.
right? And using AI, people can make striking images, let's
Yes.
put it that way, okay? Probably AI is going to apply now to write. That thing has become spread across the culture and everybody can have a go, which is brilliant, right? At the same time, how do people use that, or how do people practice in the way that they used to? Well, they can't. It's going to be a different
No.
world. And
Yeah.
therefore, something like this where images and sounds and stuff is actually curated, it's quite important.
It's like a cross between a landfill site and a morgue now, Facebook. But I can't wean myself off it. What I like about it, although it's becoming increasingly user unfriendly, next to the images I could juxtapose film clips
Right.
with music. You can kind of do on Twitter or X or Threads. People do not consume it in the same way. I love the fact that at a certain point, this halcyon moment with Facebook, it was possible to sort of mix it all up. Apart from the censorship, I was constantly being banned for the most absurd things. A Holbein drawing of a hand, which a bot had obviously assumed was a drawing of a severed hand.
As Facebook attempted to monetize its audience and did things like, so if you post a link, then actually it won't show it
Well,
to very
doesn't show
many
it,
people.
no.
So because it doesn't want people to go off the site,
Yes.
right? So the kind of reach isn't massively diminished. And by the
Yes.
way, I don't know if this actually is true, but we were told recently that by 2030 there's going to be more dead people on Facebook than live people.
That moment is quite disturbing.
Well, speaking of the dead, let's dig in.
Yeah.
Stephen, I want to say another thing about this book. So, Underworlds, dizzying ossuaries, freakish creatures of the deep sea, astounding colours of agates, lava and crystals, mind-bending organic structures of fungi, caverns, crevices, burrows, bunkers, burial chambers, ghostly shipwrecks, religious hellscapes and surreal dreamscapes, natural and constructed subterranean realms, imagined and subconscious worlds. It's all in here, isn't it?
Almost all within the limitations of the page number, budgets. Yeah, I've attempted to be as comprehensive as possible. I should say that Underworlds is the second part of what has been conceived as a kind of de facto, as a trilogy. First one being the Cosmic Dance, which is basically an attempt to map the kind of great chain of being, or the map of creation, was concentrating on the celestial and the world above. So I wanted to do the antithesis of that. And I realised, in doing a lot of research into previous literature and things, that nobody had attempted this before. There are lots of wonderful books. There were a whole plethora of books about subterranean London and the history of the underground, things like that. And I don't think anybody had attempted to incorporate the psychological elements, the mythic elements,
The dream.
and dreaming, and human involvement, and extraction, and exploitation, and things like that, which all, to me, they're all inextricably linked. So I wanted to create a book which could have both Dante and the Westminster Fatberg.
And you succeeded.
Go from the sewers to the stars.
Part 3 of the trilogy will be?
It's elements. The 5 classic elements. It's the materials that tie everything together. But that we published this autumn.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. Let's look at Underworlds right now. It's split into 5 sections, covering both the real and the imaginary, right, moving between continents and time periods, disciplines, philosophy, biology, art, history, and literature. And listener, it's absolutely stunning. I mean, for me, this is like a primer for the imagination, right? As I said earlier, you're an artist, musician, psychonaut, dreamer, psychologist, or seeker of any sort.
Psychonaut, I like.
We live in a world obsessed with illumination, where we blaze our floodlights over every secret, root out every last trace of darkness. Underworlds conjures up visions of a fiery, punishing hell, alongside crystal caves of sublime wonder. It evokes images of mycorrhizal networks connecting the roots of plants to fungi under the forest floor, and brings to mind burial places, coffins and crypts. It summons images of man-made tunnels for transporting trains or cars, and huge pipes for conveying sewage. It presents images of claustrophobic chambers of coal, gold, and diamond mines. It conjures up images of the Kraken and the Leviathan, the mythological giant squid and sea serpent. Underground also suggests resistance movements operating in secrecy and danger during wartime or under harsh regimes, and alternative cultures that challenge the status quo. Which brings us right back to the Bureau of Lost Culture, of course. There's a sort of countercultural element to it. Yeah. But that was your concept then, wasn't it? To take this sort of notion of maybe even the word underworld and actually sort of expand that.
Yes, and to incorporate underworlds and undercurrents, the world beneath, both physical and geological, but also psychological and political. The things that are maybe hidden or suppressed. The book does include things that we'd rather not think about, but it also is kind of excavating the subconscious and the id, as well as literal excavation and literal exploration. Anything that's beneath the surface, either literally or metaphorically.
The human race and the human consciousness, there's always been this awareness of physical underworld, through caves and tunnels, etc. There's always been speculation about what was going on underneath us, inside the Earth's core and all that sort of stuff. And that's been informing our fears and our myths. Then our imaginations have started to produce these underworlds of the dead or the afterworld, the world of the fairies, for instance. These two things always in rotation, like two sides of the same coin, right?
Life began underground in rock pools and tide pools, and culture and storytelling and probably society has its origins underground in people living in caves and coming together against hostile circumstances and hostile environment, forming bonds. We all, one way or another, end up underground, whether it's actual burial or our ashes are scattered.
But you can have them blasted into space now, but...
Whether we like it or not, we are intimately connected with it. The source of wealth, the source of comfort and security, whether it be heat, power, or building materials, or is from underground or from the soil.
The water, which we comprises the majority of our bodies, comes out from springs from the earth, right? So we're completely linked to it.
We are. Yeah.
Also, just in terms of the main theme of the Bureau, which is counterculture, something in that bit that I read from your introduction there that's just right at the end, it seems significant to me, because we talk about the underground, of the 50s, 60s and 70s, this alternative community. It's something underneath.
Yes.
And what's come up time and time again here is not that actually you see the counterculture in opposition to the mainstream culture. It's that they're both necessary. The counterculture is formed, you could say, in resistance to the main culture, but then it actually refreshes it like a spring from the deep. And the mainstream culture relies on that counterculture in some ways, through art, through science actually as well, through music, through ideas, to actually stay live.
Yes, to revitalise and regenerate, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Counterculture is like a seam that runs through society. Those currently in power, or those who hold sway over us, can dig deep into that and drill down into that and extract the things that they want.
They often fear it because they fear the underworld, in mythic terms, actually, because it's unpredictable.
Yes.
It's going to revolve in disruption like an earthquake or a volcano.
Or a spurting geyser or oil spill or whatever.
Or a tsunami or a...
Geological forces, and there are also tectonic social forces that I think we're in such a moment right now.
We mentioned earlier Dante's Inferno. Here is a sidebar about the epic poem. Dante's Inferno is the first part of his Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century. It describes Dante's imaginary journey through hell, guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. The poem begins on Good Friday in the year 1300, with Dante lost in a dark forest, symbolising a spiritual crisis. He encounters three beasts that block his path: a leopard, a lion, and a she-wolf, all representing different sins. Virgil appears and offers to guide Dante through hell and purgatory, with Beatrice, Dante's ideal lover, guiding him through paradise. Dante and Virgil enter hell through a gate inscribed with the famous words, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." Hell is depicted as 9 concentric circles, each dedicated to punishing increasingly severe sins. The first circle is limbo, where virtuous non-Christians and unbaptized infants reside. They don't suffer torments, but are denied God's presence. Notable figures here include the classical philosophers and poets. Basically, anybody who's not a Christian. The second through 5th circles punish sins of incontinence. I think that means drunkenness rather than not being able to hold onto your shit. The second circle contains those who are lustful, and they are blown about by fierce winds. In the third, the gluttonous lie in mud, pelted by cold rain. In the fourth, the greedy and wasteful push heavy weights. And in the fifth, the wrathful and sullen fight in the muddy river Styx. The 6th circle contains heretics trapped in flaming tombs. The poets then encounter the monster Geryon, who transports them to the lower circles. In the 7th are the violent, divided into 3 rings. The outer ring has those who are violent against others, murderers and tyrants, and they boil in a river of blood. In the middle ring, those who are violent against themselves, suicides, are transformed into gnarled trees. Not too bad. In the inner ring, those who are violent against God and nature, blasphemers, suffer in a desert of burning sand. The 8th circle is called Malabolg. It consists of 10 ditches punishing different types of fraud. These include seducers, flatterers, and also there are false prophets, corrupt politicians, quite right, hypocrites, thieves, evil counsellors, sowers of discord, and various kind of falsifiers. There's a lot of them around these days. The 9th and final circle is a frozen lake called Cocytus, where traitors are imprisoned in ice. And at the centre is Satan, eternally chewing on Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, the archetypal traitors in Dante's worldview. Throughout their journey, Dante and Virgil encounter many historical and mythological figures, each serving as an example of a particular sin and its consequences. Dante often engages in dialogue with his souls, learning about the sins and the punishments. The poem is not just a vivid description of medieval concepts of hell, but a complex metaphor of human sin and divine justice. Each punishment is a symbolic reflection of the sin being punished. For example, fortune tellers have their heads twisted backwards, forced to look behind them for eternity, because they try to see the future in life. The Inferno ends with Dante and Virgil emerging from hell on the other side of the world, ready to begin the ascent of Mount Purgatory. It's a transformative experience that prepares Dante for his ascent through purgatory and eventually to paradise.
And let's dig into section 1, which is beneath the surface. You start off by saying the earth beneath our feet may seem solid, but in fact it's constantly moving, continually transforming. The soil's composed of a mixture of rock fragments and decomposing organic material, packed with microorganisms that recycle organic waste. The top layer is teeming with living organisms, from earthworms to moles, and from beetles to fungi, and replete with the roots of plants and trees. The livelier the soil, the more fertile it is. In forests and woodlands, fungi and bacteria form an interconnected network with the roots of trees to provide a healthy underground ecosystem. Lots of images about this, and absolutely fascinating stuff to me was this, the hollow earth theory. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Although there's always been theories that in the interior of the earth there's another civilization living beneath us. This has permeated mythology and tradition for thousands of years, but the hollow earth theory became really outlandish in the early 20th century and was adopted by certain national socialists as well, I believe. There was a theory that there was an entrance to this mythical underworld kingdom at the North Pole. So, and I think sort of in the 40s and 50s, there were actual theories that flying saucers flew out of this tunnel.
A portal,
It's a portal to this subterranean world. And the people in the flying saucers would go back down underground. And I think the Nazis in particular invested a fortune trying to look for an entrance to this underground world. The centre of the Earth is as unknown and unknowable to us as the furthest reaches of space. A human being is just as likely to land on Mars or Venus as they are to reach the centre of the Earth anytime soon.
Well, completely inhospitable for a start. Right. As far as we know, anyway, yeah. Unless there's some sort of fire gnomes in down there who actually can survive in that.
I think in Greek mythology, Sumerian and Mesopotamian mythology, there are references to people living underground and there being mysterious goings-on and underworld cities and things like that.
And even in the Norse myths, there's the
yes.
Svartalfa, the dark elves, aren't there? Who live beneath the surface. I mean, and by the way, listeners, we're talking text here because this is a radio show, but this book is full of extraordinary images which illustrate Stephen's text. And Hedwig Michel here is explaining the Hessian Hollow Earth theory at 1961, and she's got this model of this opened Earth with another world inside it.
An image which sort of encapsulates the idea of the Hollow Earth theory. And I spent more time looking for an image to illustrate that than any other thing in the book.
That sort of set the scene in a sense, but this physical planet beneath us, the geological planet and its core, its molten core, and this incredible heat that's down there, and which pops up through volcanoes and earthquakes. At section 2, which is human habitation and exploitation. Step out your front door and feel beneath your feet the thrum of subway tunnels and electric cables, mossy aqueducts and pneumatic tubes, all interweaving and overlapping, like threads in a great loom. That's Will Hunt from Underground, A Human History of the World Beneath Our Feet. I love this. The Earth has always provided humankind with a safe resting place for the discarded body in the sand and soil as the soul departs for the afterlife. Since Neolithic times, grave goods, including pottery, tools and weapons, have been buried alongside the deceased to assist them in the afterlife. Further down, deeper into the layer of rocks, the earth has also provided the materials to carve out and build tombs, churches and homes. Actually, this is that human intervention just with the crust.
Just the surface. Our remote ancestors, they would have sought shelter in caves. That was the first form of shelter, other than maybe rudimentary things. But there's an intimate connection with this underworld, which must have been terrifying. Because what lurked in there would have been cave bears, there would have been all kinds of horrors and terrors in there that for early people.
Without the assistance of their artificial light, you're dependent upon torchlight, when you've got fire, right, to explore the depths and stuff. So to try and banish the darkness of giant caves and caverns would have been a wondrous but terrifying thing, right?
Absolutely. That's also, I think, part of the origin of art. The earliest surviving art that people were making marks on cave walls, either to propitiate the gods or forces of the earth or some spirit, in order to ensure that success with killing your animals, which obviously would depend on for food and clothing. Some of the very earliest cave paintings, Cave of the Human Hands in South America. I don't think anybody's quite sure whether it was like stenciling around their hands with pigment. That's just extraordinary. We are here. Just the patterns that they create. It's beautiful. It has a sense of arrangement that any artist would envy.
So the origins of our visual culture in some ways, because I suppose also a cave would be a place where it could last as well. You could make a beautiful thing, from branches and leaves, but it wouldn't last.
Or you could get a branch and make a pattern or some sort of pictogram or an image in sand or soil, but that will be washed away very rapidly. So these were the first
repositories, if you like, of arts, and also at the same time shelter, and sometimes a place where we buried the deceased. You can see where the legends of the afterlife would come from. That part of this. Section 2 is that this is what we exploit as humans, so it's actually, as well as the place that nourishes us in terms of growing food and where the water springs from that keeps us alive, it's also where we scratch and scrape and rake out the natural resources
Yes.
and we drill for oil. This is what human beings have done to build their technologies.
Where human beings derive their wealth from. The modern age was built upon extraction, primarily oil and coal and other minerals. The cause of global conflict now is going to be people fighting over nickel or copper or whatever. Places like Congo are just being devastated because people are just scrabbling for vital things.
Yeah, we largely fight over territories because of value. We're not too bothered necessarily about just grabbing barren, empty plains.
No, there's plenty of reasons why the West and why they have massive presences in the Middle East and in Africa, and why China are doing the same thing. It's obviously because of what is underneath those territories.
The next section is underwater worlds. To gaze into the depths of the sea is in imagination like beholding the vast unknown, and from its most terrible point of view, the submarine gulf is analogous to the realm of night and dreams. That's Victor Hugo.
Yes.
You make the point of the actual ocean bed, which covers a massive proportion of the Earth's surface. We don't know anything about it.
No. That's also completely unknowable. I love the idea that there is something like 5/8 of the planet. We don't know what's at the bottom of it. The deepest trend of the Pacific in particular. The fact that we're still finding new life forms down there. Remarkable, exotic, grotesque things, or things that are almost beyond our imagination every single year. On the surface of the planet, we're facing a mass extinction, but there's still these life forms that are unknown to us and will almost certainly remain unknown always.
Can't you illustrate the ones that we've found? They're these sort of terrifyingly alien creatures.
Not far from the ocean's depth, there's a fish in here that looks to me, it's straight out of Goya, one of the black paintings. There's this sort of human face with kind of illuminated, almost like dealy boppers on its head, that's sort of 20,000 feet under the surface.
The sea itself, again, exploited at its upper levels, digging down through to its crust to actually exploit the oil and stuff that's beneath it as well. The volcanoes which erupt deep beneath the surface, cause tidal
super
waves.
Volcanoes, which could finish everything.
We worry about meteorite from space, but it could be a super volcano.
It's more likely to be something in the ocean, subaquatic, that destroys us. There's this sense of this wild, untamable, it's completely unknowable. There's this great mystery that we claim mastery over things, but we cannot claim mastery underground and the forces that are there.
And if anybody's spent any time in the sea, if you go swimming in the wrong place, you can suddenly find out how strong those forces are. Section 4 is when, in some ways, all these things start to feed into the human imagination. Through me to the city dolorous lies the way, who passed through me shall pain eternal prove. From Dante Alighieri, the Inferno. We talked about that earlier in terms of your own story, but also Dante's voyage into the underworld through these circles of hell. The actual physical underworld of the earth and the sea and our relation to it has fed in, has it not, Stephen, into the human imagination.
Yes.
And a lot of the images that are in this book have been produced as a consequence of that.
Yes. But I have in the past proposed whole books of images of hell and hellscapes and hellmouth, infernal realms. So I had to sort of rein myself in a bit. In myth and in religion, in folklore, the underworld is a place where, in the classic kind of Joseph Campbell type hero's journey, where the hero has to travel underground on some sort of quest, of classic myths of Orpheus and Persephone and people having to and then emerge, transform. It's like a trial that the hero or heroine has to undergo. The fact that people imagine the worst possible thing, hell, is underneath us, beneath our feet, whereas heaven is above us. But the fear of damnation and the fear of hell and the fear of the unknown, it's easy to imagine and visualize hell and inferno, but it's far more difficult to envisage paradise.
Well, I had a very Catholic upbringing, right? So those afterworlds were a big feature in my life, and hell was terrifying. And of course, certainly the Catholic religion, you seem to end up there by the sort of slightest infringement, just by not being a Catholic,
venial of, or having the misfortune to be
unchristened,
unbaptized.
Yeah.
Well, that was the most unfair thing. Awful.
It was terrifying, I can promise you. There was limbo and purgatory, these sort of strange in-between realms. But at the same time, the thing which really did it for me was actually that heaven itself, in that particular mythology, seemed so dull.
Yes.
Seemed like a long Sunday afternoon with nothing to do. For kids, pre-mobile phones, you can promise you that those Sunday afternoons could stretch an awfully long way.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting is there's that, say, in the Greek underworld, it's not terrifying, but it just, again, sounds really sad.
Yes, it's not like Catholicism or Christianity where
You're
the damned
tortured.
are permanently tortured, where you're permanently having demons poking things. There are unbelievable torments. The Greek and Roman underworlds.
They're reserved for people who've infringed against the gods.
Yes,
in
so
some
it's
way.
Prometheus.
Sort of average mortal just ends up in this kind of rather dull, nothing to do.
Having drunk of Lethe, those forgetting everything, wandering about in the gloom, a bit like Portsmouth on a November afternoon and wandering about the seafront.
The other underworld, which I think has always seemed much more interesting in some way, was the sort of fairyland. A couple of different versions of fairyland, and of course some people associate fairyland with the land of the dead. Fairyland itself seemed much more magical sort of underworld, didn't it? And the portals to it, whether they be through the Neolithic tombs, would be filled with wild, crazy dancing and music and sort of bacchanalian feasts and stuff. That sounded more appealing.
That sounded yes, it does, yeah. One of my favourite images of the Hell Cabaret, the Cabaret L'Enfer in Montmartre.
For sort of listeners, is absolutely bizarre building in Paris. On the ground floor, it's this gigantic demonic mouth.
It's extraordinary. It's like medieval hell mouth. Such a tragedy that it was demolished. The exterior is just an amazing work of art in itself. The interior was a bit tacky with kind of papier-mâché skulls and things dotted around with candles and a few employees dressed as demons.
Like London Dungeon or something.
Like London Dungeon or something, but on a really small budget. The doorkeeper was sort of dressed as Satan. So it was fantastic. On the upper floors, at one point, surrealists, André Breton lived above it. Surrealists used to have meetings there. It was a huge success, the Infernal Cabaret, and it lasted for about 50 years. It was so successful that the same owners opened a club next door, which was Le Ciel, Heaven. That lasted about 5 years. There were photographs of people queuing up to get into hell, but nobody wanted to go to heaven.
Of course, in Paris, with the catacombs and huge underworlds of piles of skulls and arranged in patterns and stuff.
I just love that. There's a photograph I found on Flickr years ago, and it's an entrance of, I think it's called Storyland, Disneyland. It's a whale's mouth. I think it's the whale in the original version of Pinocchio, but it just looks like the medieval hell mouth. And the fact that is a child ride in the most famous theme park in the world is quite remarkable.
There's a few portals to the underworld in London, I've noticed, actually. Yeah, there's one in Vauxhall that I always used to go past, and I thought, if underneath the railway bridge, and it's this sort of door part of the way along, and you think, if you open that door, I'm sure it's going to go to hell.
There was clubs there that were a bit like hell.
That's right.
Yeah.
Heaven or hell, depending on which way you want to look at it.
Exactly.
The final section, number 5, is subliminal realms. The unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it's just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as Sigmund Freud. Of course, at some time in the 17th, the 18th, 19th century, the idea of the unconscious was invented. I had a psychotherapist in here for a while, and I said to him, did we have an unconscious before Freud? Was there actually a human unconscious before it had been identified as such? And of course it's a metaphor, isn't it? This final section, in a way, is sort of where it all comes together in terms of the human unconscious through these images that you show. And of course, surrealism, I suppose, is
part of it. Yeah.
It's part of that. The human unconscious is, in some sense, the most significant underworld for us.
Yes, because but everybody dreams, for example. Everybody has fantasies. So it's a place that we're all familiar with and we all inhabit, and we probably spend a third of our lives there or more. We spend a hell of a lot of our waking lives in that subconscious, in a world beneath the world of the material things. We're there, but we're not necessarily in that world in a sort of Buddhist sense of being in the moment and being in that certain place. We're both in the world and detached from it, so we do spend our lives in the subconscious world, in the subterranean world. I wanted to include both dreams and nightmares.
How much of our time, how much of our lives, how much of our experience is actually driven by beliefs and urges and feelings and ideas that we're not actually just conscious of?
We're not in control of.
We're not in control of. We are the image of the iceberg, with the top bit above the surface and the majority of it's beneath, is a kind of quite a telling one, isn't it, in terms of actually how we live. I'll give you an example. I consider myself a peaceful person, but as I was cycling here, I got cut up by a black cab driver, and I immediately turned into a raging kind of... It was like, well, where did that come from? It definitely wasn't my conscious mind. So
obviously, like the physical world, the geographical world, this is these roiling forces that will burst forth and be uncontrollable, and everybody, no matter how saintly they may be, are prone to these things. We sound like a platitude, but we don't know ourselves. Everybody has impulses that they cannot explain and that may be wildly irrational, and they're not necessarily for your own benefit. And
I record my dreams. Now, why? I don't record them because I'm necessarily getting insights from them, but I've got this belief, maybe in the way that you talk about images, that the juxtaposition of two things.
Yes.
Dreams present you with an extraordinary irrational images and worlds, right? Millipedes that are on fire, things that you don't see in the conscious world. So for me, there's something kind of valuable in that in terms of the way it moistens the imagination, right? And then what you show in this final chapter, of course, is how this is fed into art, particularly surrealism, but not just that, modern art as well, because there's abstract art as well, not just the visual arts as well, the unconscious feeds into music and films and all these things have actually come to some sort of subterranean fruition.
I included art that is channeled art, so it's art by medium, so mediumistic art, so art that was produced in a trance state, so the things that genuinely come from the unconscious, as well as lots of self-taught artists outside of the mainstream who haven't come from a conventional background. That represents those kind of impulses, and often in a more profound way than the more conventional artist. So I wanted it to be a kind of gallery of outsider visions, whether they be by Goya or whether they be by a patient who is suffering from schizophrenia.
As we sort of, emerge from Underworld back into the surface, on that note, Stephen, for me, in terms of bringing it all back home for the Bureaus, that the counterculture itself was a sort of eruption, wasn't it, of ideas, new ways of thinking, new images, and new ways of combining images, and of course new music.
Yes.
The alchemy of that was also to do with new substances, drugs, LSD in particular, but not just that. And it was social conditions coming together. But that's the counterculture itself, actually, as I was going through the book, could sort of see it as this volcanic thing which burst into consciousness. And of course, it was terrifying for many people, wasn't it?
Yes. The shockwaves of 60s counterculture, of 70s counterculture, and late 80s, early 90s subculture in particular. We're still feeling the tremors and the aftershocks now, yes.
And also the lava, which has traditionally been a kind of source of fertilisation for it, actually makes the soil richer, doesn't it?
I see the situationists everywhere. Thor and the others were doing this. And if you seek out the films made by those people, for example, or the films made by somebody like Bruce Conner, a true countercultural hero of mine, nobody's actually produced anything that lives up to the things that were being done almost 60 years ago and then 50, 40, 30 years ago. They're basically still stealing ideas from them. I was directed to John Galliano's collection from Maison Margiela at Paris Fashion Week. They said, you've got to see this. This is incredible. This is subversive. This is extraordinary fashion. So I looked at this and I thought, well, actually, in terms of dramaturgy and staging and lighting and spectacle, it must have been a phenomenal budget. But in terms of also makeup and lighting and things, it was under one of the bridges on the left bank of Paris. And I was looking at this and thinking, this is impressive, but an old bugger like me, I've seen this. This reminds me of this. This reminds me of this. This aspect of it is this kind of this magpie thing, this collation of everything. Elements of counterculture going back to the 20s here. The smorgasbord of influences brought into luxury fashion and fantastic stuff that nobody could ever buy.
Fashion notoriously feeds on itself. The mainstream culture feeds on itself. The mainstream culture also feeds on the counterculture because it sees youth culture in particular as being the next market to advertise to.
Yeah.
Advertising and fashion has always been the sort of quickest route between the counterculture and the culture.
And the mainstream.
You're absolutely right. The tremors, the shockwaves, the influences of that era, not in all respects, but I often feel that we live in quite conservative times. When I'm looking at the 60s and 70s, because in terms of ideas and bursting out of the underworld, there were so many of them, and it's, of course, it takes time to digest those,
What was really shocking about it, you realise this is a product of 2024, not of 1981 or 1966 was the soundtrack. Adele was the main thing. So, well, if this had been done in those previous eras, you'd have had something.
You'd have a Pink Floyd or Soft Machine or something.
Pink Floyd, Soft Machine, or you'd have had, I don't know, DAF or the 80s. Yeah. And it's just, that is where we miss out. Part of the reason why things are maybe more anodyne and tepid is the proliferation of different media. If you're in the 60s or 70s, the choices, particularly of entertainment and distraction, were so limited. If a 2024 version of the Sex Pistols turned up 5:40 on a Tuesday afternoon to be interviewed on something, it'd be a few 100,000 people watch it, at most. A lot of those on catch-up. There wouldn't be several million people sitting down there because there's nothing else to do, having their tea and then being exposed to this filth and fury. So to actually get that kind of impact is very, very difficult unless an actual physical protest to take into the street.
I suppose also that when the means of production or the means of creative production are limited, the printer that you've got is, Gestatner.
Yes.
Or, you're using kind of paste up and collage, and actually, of course, it does squeeze the imagination and actually blossom in a different way when you've got every tool, every software, limitless options. It makes it more difficult. Yeah,
it's wonderful things. I just love the fact that I can just look at YouTube and find other new music from decades ago that I've never ever heard.
For me, actually, I think we live in an extraordinary time musically. I think there's amazing stuff being made.
Yeah.
As we sort of finish up in terms of how the underworld is going to continue to affect us, yes, I think we're living in a increasingly more superficial world, but at the same time, in certain areas, there's great stuff going on.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
One of the characteristics of the underworld and the counterculture is that it actually always surprises us. So we don't probably know right now where the next things are going to come from, or what the next things are going to be. It could be through AI. I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not a pessimist when it comes to AI. Probably the most controversial image in this book is the photograph that I chose by Cindy Sherman, who obviously is one of the world's most famous artists, most revered artists. And I just love what she's doing now. I love someone with her reputation's impact. She doesn't have to prove anything. She could have retired years ago. And I love the fact that she's still creating stuff. And what she's doing now is really provocative. She's using AI for her new work. And her Instagram page is just wonderful. It's funny, it's provocative, and it's stuff I haven't seen before. Including one of the images she did with just a basic AI thing on her iPhone. She was posting hundreds of these, and people say, oh my God, what's happened to her? She's lost her mind. This is just dreadful. I think with AI, it's a similar situation to music. Like the late 70s or the early 80s, people saying synthesizers and sampling will be the death of music, real music. Hip-hop isn't real music. And they could not be more wrong. And I think AI is analogous to that, that sort of it depends what you do with it. Like the same with what you do with a synth or a sampler.
Yeah. And it could be even something that we don't even know about yet.
Yeah.
Stephen, I think we came back onto the surface, and I just wanted to finish with a final quote from you, which is, imagination thrives in darkness. And I thought that's a terrific thing to take away. We need the darkness to actually allow us to shut off from, you said, the floodlight of kind of modern culture in some ways, which allows our own internal underworld to express itself. Thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Stephen. It's always a bit strange making a radio programme about objects or art when the listener can't actually see it. But if you do get a chance to check out either Stephen's book, Underworld, or you could check out his Instagram feed, which is full of beautiful, amazing images with a narrative behind them, as he said. Also good to have our first influencer on the show. Although I have to say, Stephen doesn't meet the stereotype of what an influencer is like these days. He's also just published a book about the artist Jamie Reed, famous from the Sex Pistols covers, but Jamie was a druid. We're going to hear more about Jamie, his druidry and his art in a future show. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Keep listening. If you want to access more of our shows, check out bureauoflostculture.com, where you can sign up for our Bulletin of Lost Culture, or send a message with your suggestions, thoughts and ideas for the Bureau. In the meantime, I will see you
further down the road, round the bend, over the hillsides, for more tales from the Underworld.